I shouldn't have been born in this world. The five consciousnesses are completely lost, with no limbs, living like a flesh ball, destined to live for only a few days. Keywords of the novel. Tiancoffins without pop-ups. Download the complete collection of Tiancoffins TXT, and read the latest chapters of Tiancoffins. Chapter 1. Accompanying Burial. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Accompanying Burial. I shouldn't have been born in this world. I heard from my family that I was a swine when I was born. The five consciousnesses are completely lost, with no limbs, living like a flesh ball, destined to live for only a few days. My family was all at a loss when they saw my appearance, and my mother cried and fainted after giving birth. Only Grandpa remained calm and left a puzzled sentence to me with a gloomy expression. The heavenly coffin suppresses evil. Why should I take away my grandson's 5 senses and limbs? Even if I forcefully snatch them, I will still snatch them back for you. Later on, Grandpa disappeared with his pipe for 3 whole days, and no one knew where he had gone. It is said that when Grandpa returned, he was dragging a huge black coffin, with scars all over his body and silver-white hair like snow. In the following days, I miraculously grew 4 limbs and my 5 senses slowly recovered. When my family asked my grandfather what was going on, he kept it a secret and refused to mention it. At this point, like ordinary children, I also grew up smoothly to the age of 20. But later, a joke with my grandmother plunged me into a mysterious vortex, and I became closer and closer to that truth. I grew up in a rural area because my parents were busy, so I grew up with my grandparents, especially my grandmother who doted on me very much. In high school, my grandmother asked me a question. Xiao Su. What would you do if Grandma left you? At that time, I was playing games and didn't pay attention to the strange words my grandmother said. I casually replied, if my grandmother leaves, I will leave with her. The next day, my grandmother suddenly prepared 2 coffins, one for her and one for mine. My parents were so scared that they sent me back to school on the same day and warned me not to have any further contact with my grandmother in the future. Since then, I have had much less contact with my grandmother, but I still visit her during holidays and festivals. In my senior year, my grandmother passed away without any sign. When I received the news, I hurried back to my hometown from school. My grandmother's funeral hall is located in the yard, and as soon as I entered, I saw her black and white portrait. In the photo, my grandmother's face turned pale and her expression was serious, but I felt anxious in my heart. I don't know why I always feel like my grandmother is smiling at me. According to our local customs, I have to give my grandmother a last glance to reassure those who have passed away. At the moment the coffin was opened, a smell of decay came in. It was currently summer and the body could not be stored for long. I looked inside the coffin, and my grandmother lay quietly inside, her face pale, her lips slightly parted, as if she had something to say. I was just about to ask my grandfather if my grandmother has any unfinished wishes that she hasn't expressed yet. As I turned my head, my grandmother in the coffin suddenly opened her eyes and grabbed my arm. I was so scared that my feet went limp and I almost peed. Grandpa said regretfully, if I had known earlier, I wouldn't have let you see your grandmother for the last time. This is terrible. I dare not move, afraid that something terrifying might happen. All the elders in the family gathered around, some of whom used hot towels to apply to Grandma's hands, hoping to use this method to relieve her tense muscles and let her go. But it had no effect at all. My mother cried anxiously on the side, Mom. Xiao Su is still young. You can't really let him go with you. You want our family's life. I suddenly remembered what my grandmother said to me in high school, and my hair stood on end. Is it difficult? Grandma really wants to take me away. Grandpa sighed and smoked dry cigarettes on the side, as if he had made some decision. He came to the coffin and said to his grandmother's body, Old lady. Don't worry. Xiao Su will be buried with you. As soon as she said these words, my mother's face instantly turned extremely pale. He grabbed my grandfather's hand and cried, "Dad! Xiao Su is my lifeline. If you let him accompany my mother, then I won't live either." My dad quickly pulled my mom away and whispered a few words in her ear before she stopped crying and wiped away her tears. Strange to say, after Grandpa finished speaking, Grandma slowly let go of her hand that was holding onto my arm, but those eyes refused to close and stared straight at me. After returning to the house, everyone's faces were ugly, and my mother tightly held my hand and sobbed softly. My dad couldn't sit still and came to my grandfather's face, saying, "Dad, do you really want Xiao Su to go and bury my mom?" Grandpa didn't answer my dad either, squatting at the door and smoking dry cigarettes without hesitation. My father suddenly became anxious and said angrily, "Dad, I can tell you. This matter is absolutely not allowed." Upon seeing this, Uncle Air quickly stepped forward to smooth things out and said, "Brother, what you're saying, how could Dad let Xiao Su die? Uncle Air is the best performer among the older brothers. He runs his own company in the city and talks one thing at a time." My grandfather stood up and knocked on the ash on the cigarette stick, saying, "Let's continue with the funeral. I'll figure out a solution when something happens." Grandma's coffin had been placed in the yard for 3 days, and the morning of the 4th day was the funeral. Before the funeral, the whole family, under the guidance of Mr. Feng Shui, gave my grandmother a last glance, and I naturally didn't go, afraid of causing trouble again. After reading it, I heard Mr. Feng Shui say in the yard, "The old lady died without closing her eyes, with too much resentment. If she insists on burying herself, there may be an accident." Grandpa sighed and said, "Let's go to mourning." When I was a child, I often heard my grandfather say that he was a disciple of Dragon and Tiger Mountain. When he was young, he traveled around and killed demons, but when he was old, he came here to settle down. But I haven't seen my grandfather use any Taoist techniques since I was young. On weekdays, the most common thing is to help others see feng shui and face each other. So Grandpa doesn't seem very panicked when he encounters such a situation. My father hesitated and approached again, asking, "Dad, aren't you skilled in Taoism? Can't you handle this kind of thing?" Upon hearing these words, Grandpa let out a long sigh, as if he had aged a lot in an instant. His cloudy eyes were filled with strange emotions. "I can't solve this matter. As for Taoism, I couldn't use it 20 years ago. 20 years ago. Isn't it the year I was born?" My dad wanted to ask more questions, but Grandpa had already turned around and left. Looking at Grandpa's lonely back, I suddenly felt that Grandpa might be hiding something. The funeral is still ongoing, and I am standing behind the crowd, preparing to bid farewell to my grandmother for the last stretch of the way. The mountain village in the early morning appeared exceptionally peaceful, with scattered bird calls in the mountains, as if telling of something bad about to happen. The people who carried my grandmother's coffin were all strong men from the village. After the feng shui master completed the ritual, he called the people who carried the coffin to carry it. Mr. Feng Shui held a peachwood sword and waved it in the air before loudly saying, "Get up the coffin." The 8 big men took a deep breath and exerted all their strength to lift the coffin. The rope made a creaking sound, and the 8 of them crouched on their horses and hummed for a while without seeing the coffin rise. Uncle Air was a bit angry when he saw this. Before lifting the coffin, he had given money, but he didn't expect these people to collect the money and not contribute. He could only prepare a few more red envelopes and stuff them into the hands of the coffin bearer. But unexpectedly, those coffin bearers didn't accept it at all because the coffin was too heavy. Even if given 10,000 yuan, they couldn't lift it. Grandpa's face turned pale in an instant. He slapped the coffin with some anger and shouted, "Old lady! What are you doing? Can you really want Xiao Su to accompany you? What a sin!" I immediately turned pale upon hearing these words, and a chill surged from my soles towards the spiritual cover. Grandpa sighed and walked up to me, whispering in my ear, "Xiao Su, your grandmother loves you the most and believes in your words. You can trick her into saying you will accompany her, so let's bury your grandmother first. I looked at my grandfather with some fear and said, Grandpa, if I were to say this, my grandmother might really want to take me away. Previously, it was because of one sentence that my grandmother prepared a coffin for me. If I continue to speak nonsense now, I'm afraid, Xiao Su, if Grandpa begged you, just go and tell your grandmother that as long as your grandmother is buried, nothing will happen. I looked at my grandfather in a daze. Since my grandmother passed away, the cheerful and optimistic grandfather in my impression seems to have disappeared. I can clearly feel my grandfather's powerlessness in the face of this matter. I felt a bit dazed, and finally let out a long sigh. My grandmother treats me very well, and seeing her like this also makes me feel very uncomfortable. Forget it, then lie again. I came to my grandmother's coffin and whispered, Milk, don't worry. Xiao Su will be with you in a few days. You can take a step first. After speaking, I quickly retreated a long distance. Grandpa summoned the coffin bearer to lift the coffin again, and this time the bearer easily lifted the coffin. Seeing this scene makes me feel like I'm falling into an ice cave, and I always feel that this incident is not that simple. I accompanied me all the way to the cemetery, watching my grandmother's coffin buried in the soil with my own eyes. Seeing this family member, I breathed a long sigh of relief. But I can't be happy anymore. Sure enough, a very terrifying thing happened that night. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Grandma climbs out of the coffin. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Grandma climbs out of the coffin. The next day, Grandpa had something to do, and before leaving, he told me that he wouldn't come back tonight and asked me to lock the doors and windows. That night, I slept in the room where I used to sleep with my grandmother. I looked at the empty room and my thoughts were suddenly pulled back to my childhood when I had been living with my grandmother since I could remember. Every night, my grandmother would gently touch my head and coax me to sleep, until I started living on campus in middle school. Whenever I thought of this, my tears couldn't help but flow down. I fell asleep in a daze, not knowing how long it had been. I heard the door creak open, followed by the sound of steady footsteps. I saw my grandmother walking towards me, still lying next to me as before. My grandmother reached out her hand and gently rubbed my head. I rubbed my eyes and looked carefully at my side. At just one glance, I was so scared that I collapsed on the ground. This is not a dream. Grandma is really lying by my side. Ah! I screamed in shock. The sky outside the window was pitch black, probably in the latter half of the night. The pale moonlight shone through the window onto the bed. Grandma's stiff face forced out a strange smile, and my legs were limp. I quickly begged, Milk. Don't kill me. I am your grandson. My frightened cries lured my parents, second uncle, and third uncle all over. My dad pushed the door open and turned on the lights in the room. The pale incandescent light instantly illuminated the entire room. Everyone froze in place when they saw the scene in front of them. My third uncle cursed, which turtle grandson dug up our mother's body. My mother quickly stepped forward and helped me up, my legs weak, and I hurriedly left the room. After a moment, my dad and two uncles whispered in the room. My dad suggested burying my grandmother in the dark, but my third uncle said, Dad hasn't come back yet. Should we wait for Dad to come back? My grandfather instructed before leaving that no matter what happened, we should wait for him to come back before making plans. It seems that my grandfather already knew that my grandmother wouldn't give up easily, so he hurriedly left to look for her husband. My dad and the three of them have no other choice but to wait for Grandpa to come back first. They placed their grandmother's body on the bed and covered it with a white cloth. At noon, Grandpa finally returned, and there was also a young girl who came back with him. The girl is about the same age as me, with a pure and lovely appearance. She is graceful, wearing a white dress that exudes a fairy-like aura, just like a little dragon girl walking out of an ancient tomb. My dad told my grandfather about my grandmother. My grandfather turned to the girl and said, "Look at this." My grandfather's attitude is very humble, which makes me feel a bit puzzled. You should know that my grandfather is a respected presence in our village. Everyone should respectfully call me Grandpa Lu, but how could I be so humble in front of this young girl? The expression on the girl's face remained unchanged, and she asked my grandfather to take her to see her grandmother's body. Two people walked into the inner room, and the girl reached out her delicate jade hand to lift the white cloth covering my grandmother. After just a glance, she covered it with the white cloth. Since living people cannot carry coffins, then let the dead carry them. As soon as these words were spoken, everyone looked at each other. How could a dead person carry a coffin? Isn't this girl crazy? Prepare 2 coffins, one for the old lady and the other for. The girl placed her gaze on me and slowly spoke, "Take a bite for him." I was instantly stunned in the same place. My parents became anxious after hearing this, and it was even harder for them to control their emotions. They shouted at the girl, "Who are you? Why did you let my son be buried in the coffin?" Seeing my mother being so rude, my grandfather's face instantly turned pale and he scolded, "You can't be unreasonable." My mother was crying uncontrollably, holding my hand as she was about to walk out. "You want Xiao Su to die? I don't agree. Xiao Su. Follow Mom." I was pulled out of the room by my mother, and just then the cold voice of a young girl came from inside. "Let's go, your whole family will die." I stopped and said to my mother, "Mom, don't worry for now. Let's first ask what's going on." My mother's emotions softened when she saw me say this. I came to the girl again and said, "Why must I be buried? I can tell you. My grandfather is old, but it doesn't mean I'm old. Money is not so easy to deceive. The origin of the girl is unknown, and she is not very old. I didn't expect such a girl to deceive her grandfather's money." The girl gave me a faint glance and slowly said, "Money. What Su Tianxian doesn't lack the most is money. If it weren't for your grandfather's kindness to me before and kneeling down to beg me, do you think I would come here?" Grandpa actually knelt down to beg for the girl in front of him. I looked at my grandfather in surprise. Grandpa let out a long sigh and said to me earnestly, "Xiao Su, Master Tianxian won't deceive us. You should do as she said. She won't let you have any trouble." I was a bit dissatisfied. I had never seen such a proud woman before. I asked, "So, why did my grandmother come to harm me?" The girl's lips lifted lightly, and a cold voice reached my ears. "In theory, your grandmother won't harm you. But everything about you is not yours, it was your grandfather who snatched it from the heavenly coffin. Now is the time to take it back. When I was born, I had no limbs or 5 senses. It was my grandfather who brought me back to normal. But I never expected that everything about me would be snatched away." I looked at my grandfather, and the latter didn't say anything, as if he had agreed to this sentence. "Prepare 2 coffins, some white wax and 2 piles of stove ash. Distribute the white wax to the villagers before dark and seal the door with stove ash." After finishing these words, the girl was about to get up and leave. My mother quickly took the girl's hand and whispered, "Girl. Auntie's tone of voice was a bit bad just now. You won't let my son die, will you?" My mother also knows that this is a foregone conclusion, and a woman alone cannot change it all, but she still wants to confirm whether something will happen to me. "Don't worry, he was buried just to show those things. After hiding those things, I will find a way to get him out." Upon hearing these words, my mother breathed a clear sigh of relief, but still held onto the girl's hand tightly, hesitating to speak. My grandfather quickly asked my mother to buy white wax. In the evening, there were 2 coffins placed in the yard, one red and one black. It was obvious that the black coffin belonged to me. I refused to be buried with Su Tianxian, but my grandfather is persuading me on the side. If I don't listen to Su Tianxian, the whole family will die. Under my grandfather's persuasion, I agreed to this matter. Su Tianxian called me into the room alone, and she sat quietly at the table, every frown and smile, every move so beautiful. I have a few things to instruct you. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Live Burial. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3 Live Burial. Tonight, you and your grandmother will be buried together. This talisman will ensure your safety. Speaking, Su Tianxian took out a yellow talisman paper from his pocket. I took the talisman paper and glanced at it. There were some talismans drawn on it that I couldn't understand. You'll be buried tonight at 12 o'clock. Be mentally prepared, and we'll dig you out the next morning. Don't worry, as long as I'm here, you won't have any trouble. After Su Tianxian finished speaking, he left here. Although I have Su Tianchuan's guarantee, to be honest, I still feel a bit scared in my heart. That's buried alive. Although the coffin is not vacuum, there is naturally air flowing inside, but there is very little air. I don't know if it can survive one night. Soon, as night fell, my mother appeared in my room with a set of birthday clothes. She sat next to me, wiping away tears and complaining about the unfairness of fate in her mouth. Mom, it's okay, it's just one night. There won't be anything big. Besides, Grandpa trusts that girl so much, so there shouldn't be anything wrong. Seeing me say this, my mother cried even harder, and I comforted her for a while before stopping crying. I put on my birthday clothes and looked at myself in the mirror, feeling a chill in my heart. The pitch-black shroud was embroidered with several golden flowers, with exquisite craftsmanship, but wearing it on me reflected my extremely pale face. My dad came up and hugged me tightly, saying, "Son, don't worry, I will definitely protect you and won't let anything happen to you." Dad was very resolute when he said this. If there's really one death between me and him, that dad will die for me without hesitation. Su Tianxian came behind me and suddenly said, "You must take that talisman paper well. It is the key to your life." I nodded. I had already put the rune paper in my pocket and it shouldn't have been lost. I looked at Su Tianchuan's pretty face and hesitated several times before asking, "Will I die?" "Maybe, you shouldn't have been born. Your grandfather snatched your life from the heavenly coffin, and now it's time to give it back to him. But don't worry, your family and I will do everything we can to keep you alive." If it were in the past, I would have scoffed at such words, but now I wouldn't think so. As I walked out of the yard, Su Tianxian muttered softly behind me, "I hope that after knowing everything, you can live strong and live up to the expectations of your family for you." Grandpa sat on the step smoking heavily, the smoke swirling around him. In the contrast of night and smoke, Grandpa looked particularly haggard. Grandpa saw me come out, stood up, and came to me. He reached out his old, wrinkled hand and patted my shoulder. Grandpa's hand remained as strong as ever. "Xiao Su, Grandpa, I'm sorry for you. No matter what happens tonight, you must be okay." Upon hearing this sentence, I immediately realized something was amiss. The meaning behind Grandpa's words was like explaining the future. "Grandpa, what do you mean by this sentence?" Grandpa didn't continue speaking. Instead he came to Su Tianchuan's side and didn't talk about anything. I perked up my ears to listen, but couldn't hear anything. Time quickly arrived at 12 o'clock in the morning, and my grandfather and father teamed up to open the coffin lid, so I entered the coffin under the gaze of the whole family. I lay on my back in the coffin, and in my eyes were the stars in the sky. My mother came to the coffin and grabbed my hand, saying, "Xiao Su, don't be afraid of my mother around. If you don't come back tomorrow morning, my mother will come find you. Even if you use your hand to dig, you will be dug out." I smiled slightly at my mother and said, "Mom, don't worry, I won't have any trouble." As my mother spoke, tears streamed down her face. She looked at me and said, Mom believes in you." My father and my two uncles also came to the coffin to give me countless reminders and instructions. Finally, Su Tianxian looked at me and said calmly, "You don't have to worry, as long as I'm here, I will definitely take care of you thoroughly. My grandfather never came to see me from beginning to end, and I felt a bit uncomfortable in my heart. The coffin lid was lifted and placed on top of the coffin, and it made a creaking sound as it rubbed against it. The sound was like a nightmare that made people's hearts tense. Soon, the lid of the coffin was closed, and the last scene that came into my eyes was a sky full of stars, followed by infinite darkness. The coffin space was very small, and it was very difficult to roll over. Due to the darkness, I instinctively took out my phone from my pocket and turned on the flashlight. Suddenly, Su Tianchuan's voice rang outside the coffin. "Don't turn on the flashlight. If you see something you shouldn't see later, don't blame me for not reminding you." I quickly turned off my phone and flashlight, and as I lost sight again, my heart became increasingly anxious. I reached out and tried to push the lid of the coffin, but with my own strength, I couldn't shake it at all. In the coffin, I could still hear the sounds outside. At first, I could still hear Su Tianchuan's voice, but after a while, all the sounds disappeared. Endless darkness is devouring my hope for life, and I don't know how long it has been. Suddenly, I feel a sense of weightlessness coming towards me. The coffin was lifted up. But I didn't hear anyone's voice. I suddenly remembered what Su Tianxian had said before. Since living people cannot lift coffins, then dead people must come and lift them. Since it's a dead person, does that mean that the person carrying the coffin now is a ghost? Thinking of this, a chill spread from the bottom of my heart. I don't know why the temperature inside the coffin suddenly dropped to freezing, and my body began to tremble from the cold. The coffins moved steadily without any bumps along the way. From a third perspective, the two coffins were moving forward and backward on a dirt road in the countryside. The coffins floated in the air, and several people carrying them had pale faces, numb expressions, and very stiff movements. The coffin is getting colder and colder, and I really want to turn on my flashlight to give me a glimmer of light and warmth, but I don't want to rely on personal matters. Let's just spend this night honestly. I don't know how long it took, but the coffin shook violently, as if it had fallen from mid-air. Then I heard the rustling sound coming from the coffin. It was obvious that it was the sound of Tian on the coffin. I feel a chill in my heart, now I am being buried alive. Infinite fear spread to my heart, and I felt my hands and feet cold. I reached out and desperately slapped the lid of the coffin, and I regretted it. At first, I thought things were too simple, but without experiencing such a thing, how could I know the terror it contained? That's buried alive. Su Tianxian. Open it. Open the coffin. I shouted desperately. No matter how I call, the only response to me is a rustling sound. The rustling sound lasted for 5 minutes, during which panic lingered in my heart until it disappeared and the whole world returned to tranquility. The air in the coffin is getting thinner and thinner, and I feel like I have difficulty breathing. I don't know if this thin air can hold on until dawn. I don't know how long it took, but I felt a chill all around me and something seemed to have grown underneath me. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Endless Despair. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4 Endless Despair. Carefully feel the feeling from below, soft and very fleshy. I reached out to grab a piece of ice, and I shuddered instantly. Wait. This tactile sensation is a bit off. Slender, rough like small branches, and still 5. This touch seems to have been touched somewhere else. My head buzzed, and a thought quietly lingered in my heart. This is a finger. When I first entered the coffin, I didn't have this thing. How could it suddenly appear, and at the same time, I felt a panic under my head, just as I was carefully pondering what was beneath my head. Suddenly, a faint breathing sound came to mind in my ear. Ha! The voice was very low and light, but I could hear it clearly, and the sound of breathing was ringing in my ear. There's actually a living person under me. But the space in the coffin is only so large, how could it possibly hold 2 people? My fear stems from the sound of breathing being too close to me. In such a pitch-black environment, the last line of defense in my heart was completely shattered. I hurriedly took out my phone and had long forgotten Su Tianchuan's instructions. The phone screen emitted a faint cold light, but this faint cold light gave me some comfort in my heart. I can see clearly inside the coffin without turning on the flashlight. The enclosed space, narrow environment, and the smell of paint mixed with the smell of wood entered my nose. The sound of breathing disappeared as soon as the phone lights were turned on. I looked under me and found nothing. I breathed a long sigh of relief. It seemed that I was mentally deranged. It is possible for people to experience this illusion in extremely tense environments. At this moment, the words that Su Tianxian had previously instructed me echoed in my ears again. I quickly turned off my phone when suddenly it lit up and a text message appeared on the screen. I picked up my phone and saw that it was sent by my mother. Open the text message, there is only one paragraph above. Xiao Su. Don't go home. Don't go home. Don't go home. That woman is a bad person. You must stay away from her. The message was sent, but my mother's anxious expression came to mind. I was momentarily taken aback. Is Su Tianxian a bad person? Upon careful consideration, I know very little about this woman, but more about her grandfather's guarantee. Grandpa said Su Tianxian won't deceive me or harm me. I edited a text message and sent it to my mother. Mom, what exactly happened? Please explain it clearly. I sent a text message, but no one responded. I edited a few more messages, but still no one responded. I am extremely anxious. What should I do if something happens to my mother and her? I am buried here now, and it is impossible for me to save them. Infinite despair rushed towards me, and suddenly my phone rang again. I quickly checked and found another text message. The text message has no signature, it's just a paragraph that looks very eerie. Instantly, it made my hair stand on end. Good grandson, I'm right behind you. Suddenly, the phone screen went off instantly, and when I tried to open it again, I found that it couldn't be opened at all. Ha! The faint sound of breathing echoed again, and my mind instantly became tense. The text message just sent me a chill. Good grandson. Only my grandparents call me that. Grandpa has a mobile phone, but he never sends text messages. He always calls directly for anything. Moreover, Grandpa wouldn't say the phrase, I'm right behind you. Is it difficult to be a grandmother? How could this be possible? Isn't Grandma in another coffin? How could it appear behind me? The sound of breathing became clearer and clearer, and suddenly one hand grabbed my cheek, forcefully pulling my head back. The strength of that hand is immense, and if it continues like this, I'm afraid my neck will be twisted. I quickly turned around and at the same time, the phone in my hand lit up again. Cold light illuminates the situation inside the coffin. The scene in front of me instantly made my hair stand on end. Grandma. I actually have a grandmother under me. How could this be possible? Grandma looked calm and closed her eyes tightly, but the next moment her eyes suddenly opened, the corners of her mouth slightly raised, revealing a strange smile. Ah! I was instantly scared out of my wits. Grandma opened her mouth slightly and made a cold and eerie sound. Good grandson, why don't you die yet? This way you can always be with your grandmother. My grandmother tightly gripped my neck with both hands, and a suffocating sensation hit me. My vision became increasingly blurred, and even a horse lantern appeared. My grandmother treated me extremely well. When I was young, she would coax me to sleep every day, but now my grandmother is going to kill me. The huge psychological gap is unacceptable to me. Just as my consciousness was about to dissipate, I suddenly remembered the talisman that Su Tianxian had given me. I exerted my last strength and pulled out the talisman. In an instant, the talisman emitted a dazzling golden light, and the entire coffin was illuminated with snow. When the golden light appeared, my grandmother let out a scream and disappeared. I gasped for breath and it took me a while to recover. Looking under me again, there is no trace of my grandmother. Have you been saved? I took out my phone and glanced at it. It was still an hour before dawn. I quickly called my mother, but there was no signal and I couldn't make a call. Wait. Since there is no signal, how were those text messages sent just now? I quickly checked the text messages and found that only the ones sent by my mother were there. As for the one sent in the tone of my grandmother, it has disappeared. The unease in my heart is becoming stronger and stronger. Something must have happened at home, but I can't go out now. I can only wait for the passage of time minute by second, but fortunately there were no unexpected events in the end. I don't know how long it took, but suddenly I heard a rustling sound coming from above. Someone has come to save me. Soon I heard the sound of the shovel hitting the coffin. Help me. Quick. Help me. 3 minutes later, the lid of the coffin was opened, but I froze in place. It's 5 o'clock now, theoretically it's already dawn, but now it's still pitch black outside. And I saw a person standing outside the pit, with a figure very similar to my grandfather. I shouted, "Grandpa! Is that you?" I quickly crawled out of the coffin, and the figure stood not far away. I wanted to come forward and see clearly, but no matter how I walked, there was always a distance between me and him. "Xiao Su, don't come over." A familiar voice came into my ears. "It's Grandpa. Grandpa. Why are you here? Is your family okay?" My grandfather's appearance gave me a sense of security, but he didn't answer my question. He said, "Xiao Su, don't go home, leave the village." Don't go home. Leaving the village. Why? End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Family Death. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Family Death. Grandpa's voice choked up as he said, "Xiao Su, Grandpa doesn't have the ability to protect my family." Grandpa's words made my heart cold. What can't keep my family? Has it been difficult for parents to be killed? Grandpa. What the hell is going on here? I ran towards my grandfather, but I couldn't get close to him at all, as if there was an invisible barrier between us that no matter how hard I ran, I couldn't cross. "Xiao Su, Grandpa is here to say goodbye to you for the last time. Leave the village and live in a different place. Don't ask or investigate, live well." Grandpa's voice became weaker and weaker, and eventually disappeared into the wind, accompanied by Grandpa's figure. "Grandpa!" I screamed heartily, knowing that something must have happened at home. I sat slumped on the ground, feeling sad from the bottom of my heart. I picked up my phone and looked at the time, instantly froze in place. The time I saw in the coffin just now was 5 o'clock in the morning, but why is it now 3 o'clock in the morning that catches my eye? Grandpa told me not to go home, it's dangerous to go home, but how could I not go home? I ran frantically towards home, but when I arrived at the village entrance, I slowed down. For some reason, my shoulders became incredibly heavy, as if carrying someone behind me. Every few steps I take, I pant heavily and my body becomes increasingly cold. "Good grandson." My grandmother's voice suddenly sounded from behind me, and I was so scared that goosebumps broke out all over my body. The once familiar and affectionate voice has now turned into a deadly magic sound. I cannot turn back. If I do, something bad will happen. The elderly often say, when walking at night, if you hear someone calling you, don't turn back. Because it's not necessarily a person who calls you. I want to accelerate my pace back home, but my legs are as heavy as pouring lead. "Good grandson, is Grandma important?" The voice became increasingly eerie, and as soon as I spoke, fear instantly spread to my heart. "Is it heavy or not? So, is Grandma right behind me now? Good grandson, walk faster." The cold breath sprayed in my ear, and my scalp instantly exploded, which made me even more certain that my grandmother was right behind me at this moment. This can also explain why I feel tired when walking. How can a ghost walk normally behind you? I exerted all my strength as I walked towards home, and my grandmother's voice lingered in my ears like a magical sound. As I walked, a black figure appeared in front of me. Through the pale moonlight, I fixed my gaze and saw that it was actually a black dog. The black dog gritted its teeth and looked at me with caution, the anger emanating from its eyes almost devouring me. Woo, woof, woof. The black dog barked loudly at me, and at the same time, I felt a light sensation on my back, instantly restoring my original state. I am able to move normally now, and naturally I will not stay here for long. I will run towards home like crazy. I know, it was the black dog that saved me just now. If it weren't for it, I wouldn't have walked much. When I arrived at home, the door was tightly closed, but I could smell a strong smell of blood through the door panels. I was so anxious in my heart that I kicked open the door. The scene before me completely froze me in place. My mother collapsed in the yard, with a pale moonlight shining on her body. The moonlight blended with the blood and water beneath her, appearing very dazzling. I ran crazy to my mother's side, trembling as I reached out and flipped her over. When I saw my mother's situation at this moment, I was instantly stunned in place. Tears instantly engulfed my eyes, and the next moment poured out like a broken river. My mother was ripped open and her intestines scattered all over the ground, and her death was extremely tragic. Mom! My mournful roar echoed in the night sky. Sadness made me forget to think, and I sat on the ground holding my mother like I had lost my soul. My mother was still talking to me yesterday, reassuring me, but now her body is right beside me. I held her body and felt the stiffness and coldness emanating from her body. Who is it? Who the hell is it? I frantically vented my emotions, and after I finished venting, I stood up and quickly went to the room to search for the figures of my father and uncles. I searched through the house but couldn't find it. When I opened my grandfather's door, I was once again stunned by the sight before me. The repeated blows made me give up thinking and sit limp on the ground. Grandpa was actually hung on the beam of the house at this moment, his chest and stomach were empty, and his internal organs disappeared. All I could see was blood all over the room. Grandpa died unexpectedly. Who was that you just saw in the cemetery? At this moment, footsteps suddenly came from behind, but I didn't even bother to turn my head back. Come one step later. Su Tianchuan's voice rang in my ear. I couldn't calm down anymore when I heard her voice. I stood up and rushed towards Su Tianxian. You killed my grandfather and mother. I'm going to kill you. Kill you. Su Tianxian frowned slightly when she saw me crazy and dodged. But I pounced on the dog and ate shit. I stood up from the ground and continued to attack Su Tianxian. I must kill this woman. My mother couldn't have sent me a message for no reason. My mother and grandfather's deaths must be related to her. Su Tianxian dodged my attack again, and then aimed a hand knife at my neck. I only felt black in front of me, completely unconscious. When I woke up again, I was in my own room, staring at the snow-white ceiling for a moment. Can it be that everything that happened last night was just a dream? But this idea is just my wishful thinking. The physical exhaustion tells me that everything from last night was true. My mother and grandfather have died, and my father and uncles are missing. Tears flowed down the corner of my eyes, and overnight I lost all my loved ones, and I also became an orphan. Suddenly, the door was opened and Su Tianxian, dressed in a white dress, walked in. I couldn't calm down when I saw her anymore, but I wasn't as reckless as last night. I asked coldly, why did you kill my family? Su Tianxian gave me a faint glance and asked, why do you say that? I took out my phone, searched for the last message my mother sent me, and then handed it to Su Tianxian. Su Tianxian took the phone and frowned slightly, saying nothing before returning it. I thought Su Tianxian would say something to defend himself. What else do you have to say? End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Crying at Midnight. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Crying at Midnight. It's not me, it's your grandmother. I was instantly shocked when I heard Su Tianchuan's words. Impossible, absolutely impossible, my grandmother would never harm my grandfather. Su Tianxian only gave me a faint glance when she heard my words, and the words she said afterwards instantly froze me in place. Your grandmother doesn't want you to be buried with her. The grandmother in my impression is absolutely impossible to harm my family. But after last night's incident, I know that everything has changed. My grandmother first wanted to strangle me in the coffin, and then we went back to the village together. Grandma has turned into a fierce ghost. Killed my grandfather and is taking my life. I suddenly remembered the bodies of my mother and grandfather and ran frantically towards the main room. Arriving at the main hall, I saw 2 corpses covered in white cloth. My feet instantly felt heavy as if they had been filled with lead. I trembled as I reached out my hand and slowly lifted the white cloth. My mother's gentle face caught my eye, and tears silently slid down the corners of my eyes. The sadness in my heart makes it difficult for me to breathe, and every breath is so piercing. My mom and grandpa died. Where are my dad and 2 uncles? Where did they go? Did you also get killed by your grandmother? Su Tianxian told me from behind that my father wanted to die on my behalf after I was buried, but he disappeared after leaving the house. The 2 uncles went to search for their father's disappearance and have not returned until now. At this moment, there were hurried footsteps outside the door, and the next moment the door was pushed open. Second and third uncles stood at the door in a daze, followed by an old man. Dad! Uncle Air and Uncle San fell to their knees with a thud, and the 2 old men were crying like children. Seeing this moment, I can no longer hold back my tears and started crying together. The old man came to my third uncle's side and patted his shoulder, saying, "Death is like a lamp out. We mourn deeply." After releasing the pain in our hearts, a few of us sat in the room, the atmosphere suppressed to the extreme. I also know what second uncle and third uncle have been doing during this period. The 2 of them went to search for their elder brother but were unsuccessful. They thought Su Tianxian was unreliable, so they went to the neighboring village and invited Mr. Pan over. Mr. Pan is a yin-yang gentleman from the neighboring village, known as a living immortal, who is skilled in divination, physiognomy, and everything related to the earth. Uncle Air stood up and took out a large red envelope from his pocket, handing it to Su Tianxian. "Girl, my mother's troubles have troubled you before. This is our intention." Uncle Air's words were all too obvious. He just wanted Su Tianxian to leave, so there was no need for her to intervene in the affairs here. Su Tianxian didn't even glance at the red envelope, and a cold voice rang in my ear. "Am I very short of money? Since I have promised your father, I will definitely take responsibility to the end." The atmosphere in the air became solemn again. Mr. Pan gently stroked his white beard and stood up with a smile, making a round gesture. "The most important thing now is to bury the old man, solve your grandmother's problem, and have 1 more person and 1 more helper. The things we are currently facing are indeed these 2 things. If we don't handle them properly, I'm afraid my grandmother will come and claim her life. Mr. Pan. What exactly should we do?" Mr. Pan pondered for a moment and let out a sigh. The old lady's soul was lingering and she wanted her grandson to be buried with her. Now she has killed Brother Lonely. Let's dig a grave and bury the 2 together. If the old lady has someone to accompany her, she won't harm you anymore. I secretly glanced at Su Tianchuan's expression and found that her face was calm, as if everything had nothing to do with her. Uncle San thanked Mr. Pan greatly and asked for specific precautions. "I will preside over the old man's burial tonight." In the evening, 2 coffins were placed in the center of the yard. My grandfather and mother have been buried, but tonight we will only bury my grandfather, while my mother will have to wait until some time before she can be buried. 7 or 8 big men in the yard are drinking and eating meat. These are the coffin bearers who carried their grandmother's coffin a few days ago. I still need to trouble them tonight. At this moment, the fragrant breeze entered my nose, and when I turned my head, I saw Su Tianxian standing next to me. "You come, I have a few words to instruct you." After speaking, she walked towards the inner room, and after hesitating for a while, I followed behind her. "Tonight, your grandfather's burial will definitely be extremely dangerous, and even a slight mistake will kill you. You must remember every word I say below. I don't think so in my heart. If something really happens, Mr. Pan will be there to solve it. You don't need to be hypocritical here. We will handle anything ourselves." Su Tianchuan's expression did not change at all, maybe it was just me playing with a child's temper. She took out the shroud I wore last night. "First, put the shroud inside the clothes. Secondly, no matter what you hear or see during the funeral, don't turn back or stop. Thirdly, the first thing to do when you arrive at the cemetery is to dig up the grave where you were buried yesterday and open the coffin." I glanced at the shroud on the table and turned around to leave. Although Su Tianchuan's talisman saved my life, I have a grudge against her. After all, she is also suspected of killing my mother and grandfather at this moment. Time flies by rapidly, and soon it's time for the funeral. Mr. Pan held a peachwood sword and began to practice. In the end, the peachwood sword fiercely struck the altar and shouted, "Get up the coffin." Unlike my grandmother at that time, my grandfather's coffin was easily lifted up. The coffins are together, the yellow table opens the way, the altar follows closely, and the spirit flag follows. The funeral procession marched grandly towards the cemetery. The dark clouds in the night sky covered the moon, and as the final brewing took place, the entire land was shrouded in darkness, and the tree's original teeth and claws were soaked in a dead light, appearing so decadent and powerless. The funeral procession was walking on a rural path, but for some reason, I had a bad feeling in my heart. I always feel like something is going to happen. I think of my grandmother. She won't come again tonight to claim her life, will she? Mr. Pan walked at the front, while Uncle San and Uncle Air walked at the back. My ears were only filled with the sound of the night breeze and the gasping of the coffin bearer. Uncle Air scattered paper money all the way, and the scattered paper money flew like heavy snow. In a silent atmosphere, we walked out of the village and embarked on the road to the cemetery. As I walked, I suddenly noticed something was wrong. The surrounding scene has not changed at all, and we seem to be trapped in an infinite loop, walking on the path. A gust of wind struck, and I was startled by a faint sound in my ear. Upon closer inspection, my body stiffened and I could only hear crying. And more than one person is crying. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. 100 Ghosts Cry and Mourning. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. 100 Ghosts Cry and Mourning. Who is crying? I looked around and there was nothing unusual. Uncle San said I'm too nervous and wants me to relax. Is it true that I am too nervous? Woo-woo. The cries rang out again, and my heart was filled with tears, with grief reaching its peak. I listened very truthfully this time. It's impossible for me to hallucinate. And this sound is coming from behind me. At this moment, I am not the only one who has heard it, everyone has heard it. Crying in the middle of the night, everyone was a bit scared, and the coffiner's legs trembled with fear. The grass around began to move, making a rustling sound as if something was about to emerge from the darkness. I glanced at Mr. Pan in front of the coffin and saw that his face was gloomy and almost dripping with water. The crying grew louder and more tragic. This crying, there are men and women, old and young, and those who hear it feel scalp tingling and hair standing on end. Uncle San shouted, "Don't panic, Mr. Pan is here." Slowly prying open from the grass, a round object emerged. What is that thing? Head. At the next moment, Ghosts from all directions rushed towards the funeral procession and followed us along. The scene in front of us is extremely terrifying, with dark figures surrounding us, countless pale ghost faces appearing one after another in front of you, with dark eyes and no white eyes, just quietly following you and staring straight at you. Mr. Pan suddenly let out a scream of extreme fear upon seeing the scene before him, and his whole body began to tremble violently. He stuttered and shouted, "100 ghosts cry and mourn. Live people avoid. If you stop, 10 deaths will be lifeless. Keep moving forward." As soon as the words fell, all the figures hugged their heads and wept bitterly. They covered their faces with both hands and vigorously shrugged their shoulders. They choked up in a low voice, which contained infinite grief. As time passed, their cries became increasingly loud and mournful, and recently turned into roars. I was scared silly, my legs were shaking like chaff. Not only me, but also others. Mr. Pan let out a roar in everyone's ears. "Don't be stunned. Keep moving forward, don't turn back. Otherwise, we will all die here. If you want to survive, you can only listen to Mr. Pan's words," and the coffin bearers accelerate their steps towards the cemetery. The crying in my ears kept coming in, following me all the way. Everyone wants to get out of here as soon as possible, although they are afraid, their footsteps are getting faster and faster. At this moment, I suddenly thought of Su Tianxian. I remembered the words she said to me before the funeral. "Is it difficult?" Su Tianxian already knew that these things would happen. The crying gradually subsided, undoubtedly the tranquility before the storm, with even greater danger brewing. "Old man. You died so miserably." Third uncle, second uncle, the three of us trembled involuntarily. "I can't be more familiar with this voice, it's Grandma." "Old man, it's lonely and cold below. Don't you like Xiao Su the most? Then let's take him with us and leave." Sure enough, Su Tianxian was not wrong. This funeral will definitely be extremely dangerous. What should we do now? The funeral procession is still moving towards the cemetery, with no intention of stopping. Everyone was burying their heads as they walked forward, and Uncle Air's hand suddenly rested on my shoulder. I looked at Uncle Air with confusion and asked, "Uncle Air, why are you patting me?" Uncle Air was taken aback and spread out his hands. "Where did I pat you? It's not Uncle Air's hand." I suddenly turned my head, and a pale ghost face caught my eye, with pale cheeks, wrinkled skin, and a lump at the corner of my mouth. It's Grandma. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Buried Tombs. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Buried Tombs. Grandma's face is leaning against my shoulder. I was so scared that my body instantly collapsed to the ground. The funeral procession and the 100 ghosts were walking forward, and I suddenly fell, instantly distancing myself from my second uncle and the others. "Xiao Su!" Uncle Air shouted at me in a panic. I struggled to stand up and return to the team, but my body was like a big mountain pressing down on me. I looked around and saw countless pale and emaciated thighs, which surrounded me like trees. "Good grandson. Grandma is here." Grandma's ferocious laughter echoed in my ears. "Don't do it. Grandma. I'm your grandson. Your grandson. Don't kill me. Grandma's dry hands have touched my neck." I struggled like a madman, but to no avail, and a suffocation hit me. Just as I thought I was going to die, a pair of delicate and tender hands lifted me up. I was breathing in fresh air with a big mouth, and my eyes were a bit dark. When I looked at the people around me, I was momentarily stunned. Su Tianxian. She came to save me. She stuffed the shroud into my arms and said, "These are clothes worn by the dead. If you put them on, they will cover up your young energy. In your grandmother's eyes, you are no different from the dead." I quickly took the shroud and finally learned about Su Tianxuan's hard work. She had long known that such a thing would happen, and she had asked me to put on my birthday clothes in advance to prevent my grandmother from discovering me. Remember what I said to you. Su Tianxian slapped me out and confronted my grandmother. I know I can't be of any help here, so I ran towards the funeral procession in a hurry. During the journey, I put on my shroud. When I arrived at the cemetery, everyone collapsed on the ground, panting heavily, and all the ghosts disappeared. Uncle Air hugged me when he saw me coming back and said, "Great. Xiaosu, you're okay." Mr. Pan also came to me at this moment and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that I was safe and sound. When he saw me wearing a shroud, his face was instantly shocked. "Who made you wear this?" Mr. Pan's tone was very serious, as if putting on a birthday robe would lead to something big. I told Mr. Pan everything that just happened. Mr. Pan took a cold breath and said, "Shi can indeed block yang energy. That's not wrong, but you're wearing your grandfather's shi." As soon as these words were spoken, I was instantly stunned in place. Uncle Air also noticed the clues at this moment. He stood up and came to me, touched the fabric of the shroud, and then flipped through it. "This is really my dad's birthday dress. He looks a bit familiar when he says the shroud. He personally put on this shroud for his father, how could it be on me now?" Mr. Pan sighed and said, "That girl wants you to replace your grandfather and bury her again. This move is really amazing. I can't believe how Su Tianxian, who just saved me, could have done such a thing. Can't she? If she wants me to die, she didn't need to save me just now." Mr. Pan shook his head and said, "What she wants is not your life. It's something else. Other things." Mr. Pan continued, "If I'm not mistaken, your grandfather took something from the hands of that thing. It now wants the lives of your entire family. The reason that the girl did this is to get that thing. Su Tianxian wants my limbs and 5 senses." At this moment, out of the corner of my eye, I looked at my grandmother's grave and was slightly stunned. What's going on? Next to where I was buried last night, there was a small grave mound. Grandpa dug me out, no one will come to fill the grave, can someone bury me again? End of this chapter. Chapter 9. My dad died. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. My dad died. Seeing me staring blankly, Mr. Pan patted my shoulder and said, "Wazi, hurry up and take off your birthday clothes." We suddenly realized and quickly took off our shroud. Mr. Pan sat down with a large stone, lit his pipe, and started smoking. He exhaled a mouthful of smoke, and the moonlight shone on his face, appearing somewhat uncertain. Mr. Pan let out a long sigh and said, "I really didn't expect that your grandfather would encounter 100 ghosts crying at his funeral. It's a bit troublesome now." Mr. Pan said, "What we need to do now is bury your grandfather. We can't delay any longer, otherwise something bad may happen." Mr. Pan quickly ordered the coffin bearers to dig up his grandmother's grave and then dig a grave on the other side to bury his grandfather. These coffin bearers were greatly frightened by what had just happened. They wanted to leave, but were afraid of encountering ghosts again, so they could only obey Mr. Pan's orders. I pointed to the grave where I was buried before and said, "Mr. Pan, let's dig up this grave first." This is what Su Tianxian instructed me to do. I don't know what attitude I have towards Su Tianxian right now. I suspect she killed my grandfather and mother. But she saved me several times. So now I have decided to listen to her again. Mr. Pan was taken aback by the sudden addition of graves, as he had originally thought it was the tomb of my family. "Whose grave is this?" I told Mr. Pan what happened last night. The latter nodded and said, "Dig this up, you'll have a lot of time left, but you also need to dig up that grave. I'll see if there's any problem." Mr. Pan is naturally referring to my grandmother's grave. Several coffin bearers were helping on the side, and Uncle San and Uncle Air also went to dig together. Soon the pitch-black coffin appeared before my eyes. The terrifying experience of last night instantly surged into my heart. Mr. Pan asked several coffin bearers to lift the coffin out. As soon as they got started, a few people suddenly felt something was wrong. One of the coffin bearers said, "Mr. Pan, something's wrong. There seems to be someone inside this coffin." Just now when I was talking about last night's incident, these coffins also heard it. They have been lifting the coffin for such a long time, and they have long known how to control the weight of the coffin. This coffin is obviously heavier than an empty coffin. Upon hearing the words, "someone," Mr. Pan's face instantly turned gloomy. "Quick! Open the coffin." Several people hurriedly opened the coffin. I had a bad feeling and quickly stepped forward to help. Moonlight shone on the black coffin, coating it with a layer of silver white. With the movements of several people, the lid of the coffin was slowly pushed open. A man's reflection came into my eyes. "Big brother!" Uncle San and Uncle Air exclaimed in unison. "This face is so familiar to me. It's my dad." My brain hummed and tears instantly filled my eyes. My father was dressed in a shroud, lying peacefully in the coffin with a faint smile on his lips. I trembled as I reached out my hand and placed it under my dad's nose. "Dad!" I couldn't help but cry loudly. I suddenly remembered what my dad had said to me before. If he could exchange his life for mine, he would do it without hesitation. The fact is really so. The two uncles lost their beloved elder brother, and at this moment, they were also deeply saddened with tears in their eyes. Mr. Pan was also surprised to see the scene before him. Bury the living, replace the dead ghost. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Ghost Striking the Wall. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Ghost Striking the Wall. Mr. Pan quickly asked the coffin bearer to open his grandmother's coffin. After opening her coffin, he saw her lying peacefully inside. Mr. Pan seemed to understand something and pulled me up from the ground. "Xiao Su, listen to me." I forced myself to endure the sadness in my heart and nodded. It seems that what I said before was good. Your grandfather indeed offended something that shouldn't have been offended. That thing wants to take your family away. The grandmother you have seen these days is not your true grandmother. She has been lying in the coffin from beginning to end. Is it not my grandmother who wants our family to die? Who would that be? Mr. Pan continued, "At first, your grandfather wanted to use your grandmother's death to confuse that thing, but later he was discovered and took you for burial. Grandma's death did not confuse that thing. My fake death was also unsuccessful. Something must have happened during the time I left home and buried underground. Su Tianxian must know why she didn't say it. And why did my dad have to die for me? Who on earth told him this method? Your father died for you. In the eyes of that thing, you are already a dead person. You shouldn't appear when ghosts are crying. In its eyes, I am already a dead person, but I still live in this world." I suddenly understood why Su Tianxian wanted me to wear a shroud. So I was trying to deceive that thing. Why didn't I listen to her at that time? But upon careful consideration, it is very likely that my mother died at the hands of Su Tianxian. It is understandable not to believe her. If we want to completely solve this matter now, we must bring your mother's body and bury it together. With 4 lives, that thing should also be stopped. Mr. Pan scratched his head in frustration and said, "Why didn't I expect to bring your mother's coffin with me in advance? It's troublesome now." My second uncle quickly said on the side, "I'll take Xiao Su home now and have someone bring the coffin over." He turned his head and said to Uncle San, "Third, please wait here for us to come back." After speaking, Uncle Air hurriedly left with me. Mr. Pan shouted to the two of us, "Remember. You must be fast. If you don't come back within half an hour, all 3 of you will die." After hearing this sentence, my second uncle and I quickened our pace. The mountain road at night was very difficult to walk on, and my second uncle and I stumbled down the mountain. The two of us ran non-stop towards the village. The village not far away is so quiet that one feels uneasy. To return to the village, one must pass by a mass grave. The night was dark and the wind was high, with gusts of wind. I looked at the pitch-black village path in front of me, with gusts of wind. It seemed like countless pairs of eyes were staring at me tightly in the darkness, and I began to feel scared. My second uncle pulled me and ran forward. As I passed by the chaotic burial mound and looked at the small graves on both sides, my heart went up to my throat. It was so terrifying. Just as we passed a corner, the scene in front of us completely stunned the two of us. I saw another pitch-black village road in front of me and my second uncle, with countless small graves on both sides. Did my second uncle and I come back again? How could this be possible? But I can't help but not believe what's happening now. Suddenly, 3 words came to mind in my mind. Ghosts hit the wall. Unexpectedly, at such a critical moment, I encountered a ghost hitting the wall. End of this chapter.